with the Vice President of the United States being himself a Catholic, many of us and many people saw Pope Francis's letter to the bishops as really being directed at some of what is going on with the administration. And one of the paragraphs that from that letter that sticks out, for me, is the following. In just a couple of sentences here. In that letter, he says, quote, this is Pope Francis, the true common good is promoted when society and government, with creativity and strict respect for the rights of all, as I have affirmed on numerous occasions. And then he says, welcomes, protects, promotes, and integrates the most fragile, unprotected, and vulnerable. And then he goes on in that paragraph to end with the following sentence. What is built on the basis of force and not on truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and ends badly.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Dr. Miguel Diaz, the John Courtney Murray SJ University Chair in Public Service at Loyola University Chicago. He also served under President Barack Obama as the 9th US Ambassador to the Holy See and met Pope Francis several times. Ambassador Diaz, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And I wanted to start with your own reaction, of course, to the death of Pope Francis.
I woke up this morning to a text, incredulous. I had seen him yesterday for the Easter celebrations. And honestly, it's a huge loss for the human family. It's a huge loss for the world as a religious leader and as a bridge builder. And it's a huge loss also specifically for those of us that are Roman Catholics, because of the kind of new spirit that he brought in, that he ushered into, into the church and into our times. So I'm really, really, really sad by this news. And since I got to interact with him on a few occasions, I'm really, really, hurting from this loss. So.
And how do you think Catholics in America, and American more widely, will have been reacting to this news?
As a whole, I believe that when it comes to someone like Pope Francis and his passing away, regardless of where people have been in terms of the ideological spectrum, I can't imagine that that all human beings of goodwill are not mourning this loss. The Pope was in so many ways the kind of visionary that we needed at a times when so much of our human family is hurting, and so I have for me, I think that he spoke directly in the sense of, or more directly, not just because of the personal way, but because he was the first Latin American Pope, and as a Cuban American, I always have kind of like joked that I served under President Barack Obama in his first term, and Pope Benedict was still the Pope. I've always joked that with Pope Francis, had I been the ambassador during his time as Pope, I would have gotten to speak a little Spanish to him, which is what I did many times when the times that I was able to interact with him on a personal level. So, but I think as a whole, the American Catholic Church is a diverse church. It also has a significant number, close to 50% of its public or population that is of Latin American descent, and so I think for all of us, but in particular for those of us that have roots in Latin America, this is a very sad day.
And how would you judge the legacy of Pope Francis, firstly in the US, but also his legacy more widely as Pope?
Yeah, it's been widely said that he will be known as the Pope of the peripheries, right? The first thing he did, one of the first things back in 2000, in 13 when he became Pope, he goes out to the island of Lampedusa, right? And it's kind of like the Ellis Island, if we're going to draw some kind of comparison, right, in terms of immigrants, right? And while he's there, he issues this, the term that has become also associated with his papacy is his condemnation of the globalization of indifference. Um, I have a couple of quotes, but the first quote that I love about that he issues during his papacy comes from that time, from that visit, in which he says, and I quote him: "We are a society which has forgotten how to weep, how to experience compassion. Compassion is and mercy is central to his papacy, right? Suffering with others." And then he says, "The globalization of indifference has taken from us the ability to weep." So that kind of like gave an indication as to where he was going to go with his papacy as as a taking the name of Francis, um, a very popular saint for Christians and non-Christians alike. Saint Francis is known for his care of creatures and his love for creatures, and also for the kind of interreligious dialogue because of his interactions with Muslims. But I think that definitely on that list is the globalization of human indifference, and then the care for our common home, the planet, the kind of vision that he spoke about, and invited us to embrace the interdependence, the integral ecology of life, so that all life is interdependent, and all life needs to be cared for. He always spoke about putting people over profit. And he spoke about our need to build bridges, not walls. And I take that not just as a physical barrier, but I also, the need to tear down the relational barriers that increasingly separate our human family into ideological perspectives, in these kinds of binaries, black and white, and queer and straight, and west and east and north and south. And he was very much someone who invited us to do that. And then with some of the controversial topics, even that we are still addressing as we speak today, with respect, for instance, to the famous statement, "Who am I to judge?" that left an impact on members of the LGBTQ plus community, and his outreach to trans persons. Th- that was Pope Francis, leading with his heart. That was Pope Francis leading with humanity. And inviting us all to to listen to one another, and to listen, not to abstract ideas, and not to start with morality and judgments, but to start with concrete persons, and to listen to their stories, their pain, their suffering, and their concrete experiences. And so I think that you know we will miss this pope because of the human face that he brought to the papacy, in terms of the simplicity that he tried to model with respect to leadership. And so those are some of my the first thoughts. On a personal level, I still remember a couple of years ago, that I sang to him, picked up my guitar and sang to him one of the famous Argentinian tangos, "Adios muchachos, compañeros de mi vida," and he was like, just with this big smile, right? Which is another thing that we'll remember him by. He was always smiling, right? He was very affectionate and very interpersonal. But personally, like I said, I think it's a very sad day. It's a very sad day for the human family, especially at a time when the human family needs these kinds of bridge builders. These kinds of human persons that have a heart, to care for others rather than to condemn others. So.
And I wanted to go into that a little bit more. I mean, you met Pope Francis, of course, and I wanted to ask you about what he's like in person and what that experience is like meeting him, and what you did when you met him.
Well, so we, I met him as part of this building bridges initiative that four professors here at Loyola University Chicago started, which is an attempt to engage young people, university students from around the world, and our first meeting with students in the Americas. And that first meeting in which we dealt with issues like climate change, migration, and and some of the some of the themes that were dear to his papacy. Um, that first meeting was so successful that he invited the four of us, the four professors, to come to the Vatican. Upon also, the collaborations that we had with Dr. Amicia Kuda, who is the secretary for the Pontifical Commission for Latin America. She's one of the highest ranking women at the Vatican. So um, we had a wonderful meeting with him, which lasted quite a while. But in that meeting, just the way that he projected, once again, not just the jovial personality, that that really cheerful and what I would call spirit filled, you know personality, but also the way that he addressed, in a legitimate and authentic way, the concerns that he had for the church, for the world, um, for some of these issues that oftentimes seem to be so polarizing in terms of the cultural wars. And yet, again, during that conversation, I remember one of the things that when we were engaging him that he said was to, again, to draw attention to the young people, and to the need not to moralize, and to the need to encounter young people and their experiences and to listen to them. And then he turned to, he was the first, not just the first Latin American pope, but he's the first Jesuit pope. So he turned to the heart of his Ignatian. Saint Ignatius of Loyola was the founder of the Jesuits, and so he turned to the heart of the Ignatian spirituality, which is, to discern the presence of God, the sacred, however we want to call that ultimate, reality. If we believe, those of us that believe in an ultimate reality, he echoed his Ignatian spirituality by saying, we need to search, to encounter, to discern that presence of God, in everyday life, and in those around us. And then I also remember very vividly, the ways that he talked about marginalized communities, and whether marginalization occurred at the level of social economic factors, or whether they occurred at the level of displacement, human displacement, whether they occurred as a result of issues having to do with the earth, or whether they occurred even with respect to gender and sexuality. One of the stories he shared was, while he was in Argentina, about a woman that had committed suicide, who was a queer person, right? And he echoed the sayings of one of the saints, Saint Teresa, that between the bridge and the water is the compassion and the love of God, and that you know um, and that God is always with the marginalized, even at moments of their most distressful, existence. And so, um, to me, while he did not change official teaching on a number of highly controversial issues, right, that we still face as a society, he opened up the way for conversation, and he certainly opened up the way for people like myself who are theologians, right, in teaching theology, to begin to draw the implications of that kind of pastoral stance, in translating that pastoral stance in terms of a more critical thinking from a religious and theological point of view. So, um, again, I cannot say enough about the how this Pope opened new possibilities for conversation and listening, even if many of us may want to say that we didn't get and we haven't gotten where we should be when it comes to a lot of these issues. At least at the official level, or at the official teaching of the church. But the fact that he opened up those safe spaces to engage in conversation, to reach out in ministry to marginalized peoples, I think that bodes well, and I really pray that the next pope is able to continue that legacy. Simply because I think this is what we need. We don't need more. more polarization. We need more bridge building.
And you were ambassador to the Holy See during Pope Benedict XVI time as well. How did these two men differ as Pope?
Well, you know that oftentimes you sometimes hear, well, Benedict was a much more like the intellectual, right, or the before he had been Pope, he had been the kind of like the police keeper, right, the gatekeeper of doctrine in terms of the congregation of the doctrine of faith. And then Francis is characterized, as I was just summarizing, along these pastoral lines. I think that sometimes that's not always an accurate dichotomy, because there were pastoral dimensions to Benedict, and Benedict issued a number of statements. I mean, many that had to do with the care of the planet. And I remember during my time at Rome, he was actually known as a Green Pope, right? Because he had spoken to, to diplomats. If you don't care for the planet, if you don't care for creation, um, you cannot. We cannot promote peace. So if we want to peace, we work to to address the environmental crisis. And so that's Benedict, right? Clearly, Pope Francis picked up on that theme, and made it his one of his central signatures, right, with the publication of Laudato Si, his encyclical. Um, and then Francis, on the other hand, it's known as this kind of, he's the pastoral, and he's not. But he also, as I just mentioned from my own personal conversations, his ideas have profound theological implications. And for those of us that work in the realm of education and theology and diplomacy and all of that, I saw not just the diplomatic dimension of his ideas. In other words, the bridge building capacity of those ideas to cross across, to stretch across, and lend a hand across human differences. I also saw the theological and critical religious implications of taking those ideas and putting them into some kind of, okay, well, this is what it means to carry that out, and to and rethink that kind of vision in a theological and in a religious way, in a critical way within the university environment. And so, um, I know that the word that diversity, equity, and inclusion is under suspicion, attack in the United States today. Well, if there was a proponent of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was Pope Francis. And he did that not because of a political agenda. He did that because that's what it means to be Catholic. That's what it means to be inclusive. That's what it means to uphold the dignity and the value of every human being of our family, whether they're Catholic, Christian, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, whatever it is. It's that inherent, dignity and the human rights associated with that person that invites us, and certainly invites me as a Catholic, as a professor at a Catholic university, to be attentive to the diversity of my students, and to be fair and equitable when it comes to that diversity, and to and to make sure that I include the different perspectives that arise in a classroom or arise around me as as a human being. And so, with my neighbors. And so I think that that's yet another reason why I think that he'll be missed. So.
And as a member of a former US administration, I would like to ask you a few questions about the current administration. J.D. Vance, himself a Catholic, was, of course, there only yesterday to meet the Pope. Yeah. And, how crucial was it? These are men who have had differences. Was it important that the two of them did come together and speak in person at what turned out to be the last opportunity to do so?
Yeah, it was a very brief meeting, my understanding. Um, but if we put all this in context, that during both the campaign and then post election, there have been a lot of there have been a lot of statements and policies coming from the current administration regarding, for instance, migrants and immigrants. And the Pope just, it's not too long ago that he sent a letter to us, the U.S. bishops, really, by extension, Catholics. And this is in the broader context where we were talking about members of the U.S. society eating cats and dogs, right, during the whole campaign. I mean, this was very painful, and for me, not just as as a former diplomat and current current voice in terms of diplomacy and human rights, but also as a Roman Catholic theologian, I draw the line when it comes to maligning or objectifying or dehumanizing anyone on the basis of anything. I think that's wrong, and we ought to, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, middle of the way, uh, I think we ought to come together and draw the line as human beings whenever another member of our family is unjustly, especially dehumanized. But even if someone has done something horrible, that person is still. I mean, that's fundamental Christian teaching for me. That person still is a child of God, and I have to respect that. And so, um, on this issue, with the current administration, with the Vice President of the United States being himself a Catholic, many of us and many people saw Pope Francis's letter to the bishops as really being directed at some of what is going on with the administration. And one of the paragraphs that from that letter that sticks out, for me, is the following. He in just a couple of sentences here in that letter, he says, "quote This is Pope Francis: the true common good is promoted when society and government, with creativity and strict respect for the rights of all, as I have affirmed on numerous occasions." And then he says, welcomes, protects, promotes, and integrates the most fragile, unprotected, and vulnerable. And then he goes on in that paragraph to end with the following sentence: what is built on the basis of force and not on truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and ends badly. And I think that those words need to be repeated as a mantra again and again and again, because nothing that is done in violation of human dignity and rights, nothing that is done by force, um, in the end, in the immediate immediacy of time, yes, it might achieve some purposes, but in the end, it doesn't achieve what all of us, human beings of goodwill, regardless of where we live, would want, which is to preserve the respect the law, to respect fairness, to respect justice, to carry out whatever has to be carried, but to do so in a way that is that honors our fellow human beings, that does not send a signal to other nations, other less than um, willing leaders who are just looking for opportunities to carry these kinds of actions in ways that are profoundly um, dehumanizing towards the most vulnerable populations. We don't want to send a signal, certainly not as the United States of America. And so I'm glad that he met the vice president yesterday, even if for a few minutes, and I pray and hope that that meeting, just like in my meeting with Pope Francis, that meeting with the vice president was able to open up a little bit of those, the heart and the mind there, um, so that he, as the leader, as the vice president of the United States, who has contact with the president and others, um, can grow in compassion, towards even those persons that they may not agree with. So
And the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, was in the White House just days ago. What have you made of the impact diplomatically of Trump's policies on US relations with Europe?
I think many of us as educators have discussed this, because this is common conversations now in universities, right? Given the break in practice, right, that is occurring when it comes to our friends, when it comes to our allies. Some of us, I arrived in this country when I was a little boy. I'm Cuban American. So some of us have lived in societies where freedom of expression, education, um, in the freedom to, to be who we were created to be, um, is not protected. And so for persons like myself, these times are traumatic. Bring back, at least for me, they bring back traumatic memories and childhood memories. Um, and I certainly don't want to leave my country or my second adopted country. I've lived here; it's practically my country because I've lived here since I was a little boy. I certainly would not want to even think about, leaving my country. And yet, I hear students. My students are afraid. They're afraid of what is happening all around us. They know, the age old treaties with, with NATO, for instance. They know of, of the cost of lives, that in the heavy price that so many men and women paid during the wars. And we know of the atrocities of the Holocaust, and all is taken to get to where we are, both globally and from the perspective of the United States, in terms of the various, you know, um, struggles for human rights, including the civil rights. But that's just one of many, in terms of gender, sexuality, race, etc. We know how hard it's taken, to get here, and it is painful. It is truly, for many persons, traumatic to see, is this what we want to do? Is there a better way to achieve, that common good and that common ground, than to have to all of a sudden erase, history, and carry on deportations in a way that can, undermine fundamental laws that have shaped and not to continue to shape not just our democracy but democracies around the world. And so I think that, we all live, and it's not just us here as Americans, but I think the world is living in this kind of precarious moment. um, and many of us are really praying and trusting that that our better angels prevail, so that, because I do believe that at the end of the day, there are more people who believe in this vision of commonality than they do in the kind of polarization and culture wars that are happening. I think we need more people to step up to the plate, and we need more simple persons like you and me and others, right, in the streets, to say enough is enough. We will not stand for this. We've gone, we've accomplished too much. We may not all think alike, um, and at the end of the day, we may still hold our differences, but we cannot turn those differences into division. We cannot do that.
And the Trump administration has been pushing very hard for a ceasefire in Ukraine. We saw Russia claim it was holding an Easter truce, but there's little evidence that they actually held to that. How worrying was that on an Easter where both Catholic and Orthodox Ukrainians were celebrating on the same day?
Yeah, I mean, again, there is another right. This is another very, um, heartbreaking situation with the war in Ukraine, um, and and the fact that for any of us, again, that have lived under any form of dictatorship, um, we know what that is like. And so the innocent suffering in the taking of lands, um, is something that, European powers, in conjunction with the United States, from the moment that, this war started, have condemned, the innocent loss of lives and the taking of lands that do not belong to Russia. And so, all of us. I don't think, well, I mean, I'm not going to say all of us, but I think that there's a significant number of Europeans and Americans that want the war to be done. I mean, I think the Ukrainians, I'm sure, want this war to be done. Um, but the means. This is a good Catholic principle. The means doesn't justify the ends. In the sense, we need to be make sure that how we achieve that end of peace is done in a way that is also just, right? Because again, the issue is not just short term. The issue is long term, and what kind of message we send across the world. And do we really stand with our friends? And do we really stand for justice? Do we really stand for, and speak truth to power, or or do we not? And when it's our turn, and it could be our turn someday, will our friends then abandon us, and not stand in solidarity with us if we ever needed, that support? And so I think that we really have to think about these things, and of course, as Christians, we don't want war. Those of us that are Catholic, yes, there's a long policy in terms of, under what conditions is violence right justified. But in the end, those of us that follow Jesus, we know that, the great bridge builder and peacemaker wants us to enact that towards one another, nations towards one another. But there also has to be the element of, okay, well, how do we get there? And we cannot get there by pushing away and erasing the injustice, or by erasing the actions that have led us to the present moment. And so, um, again, I think that we need to continue to work to bring about peace, but that peace cannot be done in a way that is unjustly so.
And if I can just keep you for one last question, if that's all right, as I appreciate we've gone on for some time. Pressure is mounting on Pete Hegseth and others in the Trump administration over the use of the Signal messaging app to share possibly sensitive information. Having served in a US administration, how important is it for people to follow the rules and regulations of public office, and more importantly, perhaps set an example?
100% important. Um, as an ambassador, I could not, you know, walk into a room with my cell phone. I had to put, whenever it was a room that, of course, where sensitive information uh, could or would be shared, right? And so um, I could not use Signal. In fact, I had a cell phone from the State Department, but I also could not communicate on that cell phone if it was sensitive, classified, or any information that could compromise the lives of anyone, military or otherwise, right? Or even, sensitive information in terms of, like, of persons that offer governments, life saving information, in a timely manner. And so I couldn't use the means of communication to expose in any way those informants, or to expose in any way sensitive information. I mean, this is why there are laws that govern clearance, and there are laws that that govern who has legitimacy to have access to sensitive information. And so I think, again, that this is one of those things that it's not about right, left, middle, Republican, Democrat, Independent, or even Europe, conservative, liberal, you know, of the left, of the right. These are just basic practices that carry some wisdom throughout the ages in terms of how information is protected, how information is best, shared, and then also how to care for, responsibly care for, and protect vulnerable lives, that include, those in service, but also include others who may provide information, the kind of information that is provided to, to us, and and to Great Britain and others, that can save lives. And so I think that, again, Yes, 100%. Leaders have a duty, um, first and foremost, to embody what they hope others, you know, will follow. And certainly, I just couldn't imagine as the former ambassador, when I was the sitting ambassador, um, doing anything that could compromise any of these publics that I mentioned. And so I think we need to return to the strict adherence of legal processes, processes that protect and have been created precisely to protect information and to protect vulnerable lives. Because this is what makes it's not about secrecy. It's really about care, and it's about protecting vulnerable lives, and it is about protecting information that cannot land in the hands of, because we can't be naive, we can't romanticize. We know that they're human beings who around us can act on that information in a way that is not in the service of the common good. And so I think we really have to be mindful, and in the case of the United States, we really need not just the judicial branch, ultimately with the Supreme Court, but we need the legislatures. We need the legislative branch. We need the congressmen and women and senators, particularly those that come from the Republican Party, to step up to the plate. And we need to really, more than anything else, say, this is again not a left or right issue. This is a diplomatic, a responsible, whatever words we may want to use, but this is what must be done, because this is what has been done and what has been proven um, to be in the best interest of our policies, and of our and the best of our of our laws, etc. So
Well, Ambassador Diaz, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
thank you so much for having me, and to everyone across the Atlantic, best wishes as we continue to work together as a community of nations to address the big challenges that confront us.